Welcome to the ESCAP E-learning Series on Public-Private Partnerships, or PPP. In this first module, we'll provide you with a broad overview of what is a PPP and what are the main differences between PPP and traditional infrastructure procurement. Let's start by defining what we mean by a PPP. A PPP is a long-term contract, typically over 20 years, between a private party and a government entity for the provision of public services and/or development of public infrastructure, in which responsibilities and rewards are shared. PPP can be in a wide range of sectors, as roads, energy, rail, education, water, or health. There are a number of typical characteristics that differentiate PPPs from conventional project approaches. We have structured this presentation around 4 of the most important ones. First of all, funding sources. Traditional public infrastructure projects are financed by the national budget of a country. To build infrastructure this way, the government selects a contractor and pays this contractor based on the progress of project construction. This means that most payments are made upfront during the construction phase. In a PPP project, private investors are financing the infrastructure, but they are not doing it for free. They expect to generate a profit out of their investment, which means that they have to be remunerated. There are typically 2 ways that private investors in PPP projects can generate a return on their investment. First, private partners can be granted rights to collect fees from users, like collecting tolls on highway for road projects. Second, the government can reimburse the private partner through what are called availability payments. In the case of availability payments, the private operator is paid based on the availability of the asset over time. In the example of a highway project, the government may check at regular intervals if the asset is available, meaning if the road can be used, and if the asset meets the quality standard defined in the contract, meaning the quality of the road surface is sufficient. If the ability criteria are met, the government pays a fixed fee to the private operator. If at some point in time the asset no longer fully meets the availability criteria, then the payment by the government is reduced. This approach serves as a strong incentive for the private partner to maintain asset performance over time. So while in traditional infrastructure projects, payments are made upfront, in PPPs, no public funds are disbursed during the construction phase. Payments to the private partner are spread over the lifetime of the project once the project is operational. The second key difference between PPPs and traditional procurement models concerns duration. In traditional procurement, the relationship between the government agency and the private contractor ends once the construction phase is over. In PPPs, the relationship continues far beyond the completion of construction, as the private partner is responsible for not only building the infrastructure, but also operating it for a set number of years, typically more than 20. Correspondingly, the public authority must monitor the performance of the private operator through the length of the contract. At the end of a PPP contract, asset rights usually revert back to the public authority, and this is a major distinction between PPPs and outright privatization of public assets. A third element that differentiates PPPs from conventional projects is that requirements are defined in terms of outputs, what we want to achieve, while traditional procurement focuses on inputs, how to achieve what we want. In the case of a highway project, this means that project specification in PPP might refer to indicators of road surface quality, rather than the specific details of road construction. For an airport, an output could be handling capacity of 10 million air passengers per year, whereas an input might be 2 terminals, each of at least 250,000 square meters, and so on. Using output specification provides the private sector with the opportunity to come up with innovative solutions for delivering the public services, which might result in significant cost savings. This focus on output specification requires a fundamentally different mindset. It may necessitate adjustment from public partners, more familiar with conventional, input-oriented approaches. The fourth and final key characteristic that makes PPP distinct from conventional project approach concerns risk allocation. While in traditional procurement, more risks are borne by the public sector, in PPPs, risks are shared among public and private partners. For example, in PPPs, the private sector usually supports the construction and operational risk. But what are these risks? With any project, there is always a risk that construction and operation costs may exceed the estimated budget. In a traditional procurement model, that financial risk is placed solely on the shoulders of the government entity. In a PPP project model, risk is allocated to the private partner, charged with undertaking the construction and operation. This means that in a PPP, the public sector is not exposed to risk from potential cost overruns. In a PPP, the risks are typically reviewed at the outset, and the project is structured to allocate risk to the partner who is best equipped to manage them. That covers the 4 key differences between PPPs and traditional procurement models. Now let's have a look at some of the key benefits of a PPP structured project, as well as some possible limitations. The first benefit, and one of the primary reasons governments are increasingly considering the PPP approach, is to attract private capital. PPP is viewed as a viable means to finance projects that would not otherwise be feasible due to public budget constraints. PPP projects are, however, not free. The private sector has to be remunerated for its investment. Using a PPP structure can provide short-term financial relief. However, this will only alleviate infrastructure funding issues to the extent that user fee can be charged or that additional revenue can be generated from the public asset. Speaking of additional revenue, take our earlier example of an airport. From a public perspective, an airport is mainly seen as a means to provide transportation services to passengers and airlines. The private sector might be able to identify and develop more efficiently other sources of revenue from this asset, such as shops, hotels, car parks, and so on. These revenue sources could serve to partly fund the infrastructure investment. A second benefit and key motivation for employing a PPP model is the realization of efficiency gains through improved project delivery, operation, and management, and access to technology. The goal is to improve the quality of public service delivery by taking advantage of private sector efficiency. A third benefit realized with the PPP model involves the creation of long-term solutions for the provision of public infrastructure through addressing issues such as poor construction quality and inadequate maintenance. Indeed, if you are responsible for operating an asset for 20 years, you will make sure that the asset is built properly. Similarly, if payment will be withheld if the asset fails to meet the performance standards, then you will be sure that to allocate sufficient resources to asset maintenance. PPP structure also creates incentives to reduce the life cycle cost of assets. Take a highway example. Let's assume that there are 2 options to build a road. With the first option, construction will be cheaper initially, but maintenance costs will be greater over the long term. The second option might be more expensive in terms of construction, but will have lower maintenance costs over the long run. In a PPP project, the private partner will select option 2 because it integrates maintenance cost implications into the overall project design and will be the cheapest alternative over the lifetime of the asset. The fourth and final key benefit of the PPP model relates to the transfer of risk to the private sector. By transferring risk to the private sector, government finance are protected against potential cost overruns that are often significant in public infrastructure projects. Now that we have presented benefits of a PPP approach, let's have a look at the limitations. First, PPP are not suitable for all types of projects. Even in countries where PPPs have been promoted actively, only a limited share of public infrastructure projects has been pursued through this model. PPPs do not work well in sectors with rapid change, such as IT, but work better if there is a long-term, predictable need for infrastructure services. The key question in this regard is, do you need the infrastructure to be serviceable for the next 20 years? If the answer is yes, then PPP might be the solution. Secondly, the structural complexity of PPP projects can create high transaction costs. The project must be big enough to justify such increased procurement costs. With this in mind, some countries only consider PPP model for projects with budget above a certain threshold, for instance, $20 million. Another limitation of the PPP approach can be the lack of capacity of local companies to deliver this type of project. Local companies might not be equipped to manage the risk related to a PPP project. PPP can also be sensitive from a political point of view. The public might feel that the government is giving too much or is being too generous with private sponsors. In addition, the establishment of PPP might coincide with the introduction of the user pay principle, which can create public discontent. In the light of this, strong political support is critical for the success of a PPP project. Finally, PPP structure can be relatively inflexible and poor at accommodating change. For instance, it might be costly for the public entity to modify project specification once the project has been awarded. That concludes the first episode of our e-learning series on public-private partnerships. We hope you have enjoyed. Thank you for your attention and interest in the work of ESCAP. Please check out the ESCAP website for more information and additional resources on PPPs at www.unescap.org. Thank you.